sum of debt, with the sum of debt therefore inherently increasing at an escalating rate of ever greater sums of periodic interest on an ever greater sum of debt, until, of course, at an inherently escalating rate we eventually reach a terminus of a terminal sum of debt which exceeds our ability to service it any longer, which inability destroys our creditworthiness to borrow further, resulting in any lack of legitimate capability to maintain a vital circulation by further borrowing, with a natural form of the failure therefore resulting in immediate deflation of the circulation, as virtually the entire circulation is dedicated to servicing the falsified sum of indebtedness and is paid out in very little time, and with no further ability to borrow it back into circulation, therefore resulting in utter immediate defeasance of the system. And this, of course, this explains what all the current means of artificial sustention are doing, is they're reflating the circulation artificially beyond the terminal lifespan of the system by assuming further federal debt, largely, which we can't even afford to service. No country in the world can afford to service. So how does this apply to whether George W. Bush is at fault for this? Well, of course, he is at fault. Every president who rises to power declaring change that he's going to solve our problems, which are man-made, imposed problems, which are simply solved, in which every one of these presidents has received a proof of singular solution to. Of course, George Bush is at fault. But statistically, each succeeding administration is more at fault in terms of their contribution to a further compounding of the problems is concerned, because of this inherent escalation of the rate of failure. That is, ever greater sums of periodic interest on an ever greater sum of debt. So what we can see from the pattern of failure owing to our thesis of inevitable failure is that, yes, Jimmy Carter was more at fault than a prior president statistically, than Gerald Ford, that is, because inherently the sum of falsified indebtedness was escalating at an inherently escalated rate. If you're old enough to remember, you may remember Reagan turning to Carter after, each had received the nominations of their respective parties and in national debates, and Reagan gave Carter the evil eye, turned to him, and he declared the $150 billion of federal debt that Carter had accumulated over 4 years, something we would only dream of now. We would herald in this day and age as a tremendous achievement. Reagan turned to Carter, gave him the evil eye, and declared that this $150 billion of federal indebtedness was, quote, unforgivable, unquote. Unforgivable. Unforgivable. Reagan already had my material, which was a proof that he could only accumulate further debt than Carter. In 1979, he had a proof that he could only accumulate further debt than Carter because of this inherent escalation of multiplication of falsified indebtedness. Further had a proof that this multiplication was unwarranted, that the obfuscation of the currency was unwarranted, that its only solution was mathematically perfected economy, and he even received a prescription for how to convert the present system into mathematically perfected economy in less than a day by merely eradicating exploitation from the obfuscation of our currency, which was entirely unjustifiable. Yet he turned to Carter and pronounced Carter's accumulation of federal indebtedness as unforgivable. An unforgivable crime, in other words, which Reagan would exceed many-fold over, inherently owing to the obfuscation of the currency. And of course, this proof inevitably manifested in Reagan not only far exceeding the indebtedness that Carter was accused of being of having committed an unforgivable crime against the people. Reagan, in 7 years, accumulated more federal indebtedness than in the prior 200 years of history of our country put together. In 7 years, he far outstripped Carter's indebtedness many, many, many times over. So, in his own words, by his own yardstick, Reagan's crimes against us were many, many, many times unforgivable. So, each president or each administration, including each Congress, each Supreme Court, every branch of government together, which has a responsibility to serve the people, is a greater criminal statistically than the prior administrations because of the obfuscation of the currency, because they've allowed, in the case of the United States, 12 private corporations to comprise this purported central banking system, which dispossesses the people at an inherently escalating and inevitably terminal rate by this obfuscation of the currency. Every president, then, is equally responsible in the nature of the crime that they perpetrated against the people. So, while we can say that Barack Obama, in his first 100 days of office, exceeded what Bush had done in the prior year, because there were multiple issuances of money to rescue the very criminals against us, the banking system. Now, Barack Obama had already received his campaign had already received and requested even my material. Again, Barack Obama received a proposition of mathematically perfected economy and my offering to invalidate any other contending proposition. And because his economic policy team knows my work, knows they have no argument against it, my papers will return to me, that is, sent certified delivery, return receipt requested, as stipulated and agreed by the Obama campaign people. That material, my offers of mathematically perfected economy, and to invalidate every other contending proposition, that offer was returned to me without even opening it. Now, how would you return it without even opening it if you did not know that you had no arguments against the arguments that were offered? You know you were wrong. So now, every president, since and including Gerald Ford, has received a package regarding mathematically perfected economy. And I don't just send these willy-nilly to these people. I confirm that, this material might be desired. A very interesting thing has happened now in recent presidential campaigns, and that is that most of the candidates don't even provide telephone numbers any longer for you to contact their campaign people directly. And this includes Sarah Palin, who hasn't even declared a candidacy, but it's more or less obvious that she's been, cozying up to a possible run for president herself. She even has a Facebook group that she purports to report on, the financial state of the country, and which of course relates to the very same state in the world because it's reflected across the world. There is no such thing as a non-global solution. Any solution, if there is more than one solution, has to be global in state because it inherently applies to this obfuscation of the currency. If it's right, justify it. If it can be justified, why doesn't a justification exist in all history? Why can't the Bank of England answer a yes or no question? Does the Bank of England give up lawful consideration in its falsification of debts of the people? In other words, in its mere publishing of further evidence or representation of our very own promissory obligations to each other. We don't borrow those from the bank. It's merely producing further representations of our promissory obligations. We don't owe the banking system any money, albeit we do have an obligation to pay and to retire principal only from circulation, because there's no property at stake of the banking system. There's no justification at all of paying the banking system interest on the principal or multiples of the principal, which it's already laundering into its unrightful and unwarranted possession. So these are monumental crimes against the world, and you can understand why people are torching buildings. But this does not solve our problems. So I was hoping, and perhaps the reason that Mr. Gerard Batten, member of European Parliament, declined our invitation to come on the program, hopefully for today even. Perhaps his reasons were that he anticipated that he'd be presented this concept of mathematically perfected economy, and somehow, regardless whatever his reasons were, which of course he didn't state explicitly, he said he'd taken a look at the site and decided it was not for him. But good luck. Well, I can hardly imagine any person who's legitimately concerned with representation declining such an invitation as that. If I wanted to distinguish myself from all other purported representatives of the people who, of course, are denying us representation, I would instead warmly engage in the offer, which I would do then if I was any candidate for president. And of course, we had Jason Draper, head of the Independent Party of Canada, recently running for Canadian Parliament, a seat in Canadian Parliament on a platform of mathematically perfected economy. And of course, Jason contacted me. This is what legitimate representatives of the people would do. So I'm disappointed in Mr. Batten. I hope he would reconsider. And in particular, I would hope he would reconsider and voice his concerns about whether or not the European Union somehow may be denying the people of their rights to representation as precipitates in these events. Because, as I've said, until we resolve the root causes, the issue festers. And what we need to understand, and what most of us who have listened to my prior programs do understand, certainly by now, is that the obfuscation of the currency isn't just a crime that just sits there dormantly, affecting us to some degree all some while. it affects us to an ever escalating degree. And indeed, what do we see then? We see in every country of the world, we see Greece, Italy, we see Spain, we see all these countries, and